So we've seen how we can use Node and Express to access an incoming HTTP request and then send back an HTTP response. In this lesson, we'll start to look at how we create different responses for different types of requests. The feature of Express that we'll use for creating different responses for different requests is known as routing. Here we see our index.js file. As always, at the top, we're going to require Express, and then we'll use the Express function to create our app. As we've seen before, we can use the app.use function to specify the callback function for each individual URL. In this case, the URL will be /about, and when our server gets a request for /about, it will invoke this callback function, which in this case will send back the HTML that says this is the about page. But within our index.js file, we can create other routes. For instance, in this case, when we see the /login URL, we'll invoke this separate function, which will send back this is the login page. In this case, we're not going to specify a specific URI, but rather this will be the default, that this callback function would be invoked if none of the previous ones were invoked. Here, we have the callback function that takes the request and response. And if we get here, that means that we could not service the request. So we'll send back the 404 status along with the content not found. Each of those functions that I showed is known as middleware. In Express, middleware is a function that is invoked during the handling of an HTTP request. It's called middleware because it's used in the middle between receiving the request and sending back a response. And as we'll see later in this lesson, multiple middleware functions can be changed together on the same request to construct the response. A simple middleware function that we can use is express.static. This will allow us to serve static files such as HTML, images, etc. that are locally stored. In this example, we see index.js. We'll of course use the express function to create our app, and then we're going to specify that any URI that's in the /public folder should serve static content. We'll use the app.use function, and the URI is /public, and we'll use the express.static middleware function, and we'll specify the folder or directory that holds the static content. In this case, there would be a folder or directory called files that would hold, for instance, our HTML files. So here we have an example where we have a static HTML file. This would be in the files directory called index.html. And it's just an HTML file. It has h1 tags, etc. And it could also include an image, which is in a directory relative to the files directory. Here, this image would be in the files/images folder underneath the root of our Node application. When we access this page through our Node Express app, we would just see the HTML rendered in the browser. And as you can see here, the URI is for public index.html. Our app knows that anything in public, it should look in the files directory locally on this computer, and then it will find the file called index.html. In addition to simply sending back static HTML files, we can choose to send back specific files. For instance, in this example, when we're handling the 404 not found, rather than sending back the string not found, we can choose to send back a file that maybe includes the message that the requested resource couldn't be found. We'll use the sendFile function to return a file. This variable __dir name just specifies the location of where we've installed our Node app, and we'll say that we've created a 404.html file that we want to send back as a result of this request. The middleware that we use in our Express app are just functions. They can contain any amount of JavaScript code. We can do whatever we want. The functions take a request and response, as we've seen, but a middleware function should also take a parameter called next, which refers to the next middleware, the next function to invoke in the chain of handling that request. Now let's see how we would create a middleware function that would be in the chain of our requests. we'll create a function called logger that takes the request, the response, and the next function to invoke. From the request, we can get the URL that was requested, and we can create a new date object that just specifies the current date and time. Then we'll log to the console that we received a request for this URL at this time. And very, very, very important, we must invoke the next function so that the next middleware in the chain will be invoked. Here we say app.useLogger, meaning that the logger middleware will be invoked on any HTTP request. It's going to be in the chain of any request that we get. Now perhaps, though, in this case, we only want to have the logger used when we access the static files in the public folder, but we don't want the logger to be used, for instance, when we have the 404. In that case, we can just comment out the fact that we're using the logger in every chain, and in this particular route, for a URI that's in the /public folder, we can first say that we're going to use our logger middleware, and then call express.static. This shows that we can have any number of middleware functions specified in the app.use function when we're creating a route for this particular HTTP request. One of the nice things about using middleware is that not only are they called in the order in which they are specified, but they're sharing the same request and response objects. And a middleware function that's upstream of another can modify the request so that downstream functions can then use what's been modified previously along the route. So here we see an example where different routes use different middleware functions, and one middleware function will modify the request so that it can be used by another middleware function later on. If we look at the bottom of the code first, we see that we're using app.use to define a route for the /welcome URI. The first middleware function that's invoked is the name finder, which we see defined at the top of the screen. Name finder is a function that takes the request, the response, and next. Name finder will use the request's query to get the name. As we saw in the previous lesson, the query is just part of the URL that follows the URI and provides some information that's been passed by the browser. If the query contains the name will be defined, and we will add a property to the request called username, which will take the name and convert it to uppercase. If name is not defined, that if the query does not contain a name, then we'll still add a property to the request called username, but we'll set its value to guest. And as always, very important at the end of this function to invoke the next function. In this case, the next function in the route is the function called greeter, which we see defined up here. Greeter is a middleware function that takes the request, the response, and next. It's going to start our HTTP response by setting the status to 200 and the content type to HTML. And then it's going to write hello and then the username. Remember, the username is the property that was set by the name finder, which was upstream in this route. Then it will call next, which will go to the next middleware, which in this case is just a little anonymous function that's going to call response.end to send the HTML and close the connection. Now let's see another route at the bottom of the screen. This is the route for /admin. In this route, we'll first invoke the admin name middleware. As we see, admin name is also a middleware function that takes the request and response and next, but it simply sets the username to admin and then invokes next. It too is going to use the greeter, and in this case, when the greeter calls response.write hello followed by the username, the greeter doesn't care who set the username. The greeter doesn't know that it was name finder or admin name. It doesn't know where the name came from. The greeter just knows that their request should have a username property. We often find that we have the same combinations of middleware functions used in different routes, and we can combine these middleware functions into subroutes using what are known as routers, and then use those within our routes. Here in this example, we're just combining a lot of what we've seen previously. We've got the name finder, greeter, and admin name from the previous example. We've got the logger that we saw earlier. And let's just say we have some other middleware functions, for instance, a header and a footer, etc. Now in this case, when we have /welcome as the URI, we'll start by invoking the logger, then the name finder, then we'll do something with a header. We have the greeter that was using the name that was set in the name finder, the footer, etc. For the admin root, we also have the logger, the admin name that we saw in the previous example, the header, the greeter, the footer, and so on. So we can see in both of these roots, we have this subroot of header, greeter, footer. We see it for welcome, and we see it for admin. It would be easier if we could combine these into some common subroot. And we can do that using the express.router function. Here we see we're creating a variable called common root using express.router. Then we can say that in this common root, we're going to use the header, the greeter, and the footer in that order. Now we can take header, greeter, and footer from here and just replace it with common root, which we've defined up here, and we can do that for admin as well. In summary, Node and Express allow us to create web applications, and routing allows us to specify different functionality for different HTTP requests. The functions that are involved are known as middleware, and each middleware function can handle a different part of the functionality. We can chain these middleware together to pass values from one to the other by modifying the request object. And we can use routers to combine middleware functions into commonly used subroutes.